All right, so the subject we're going to be looking at today is American imperialism, which is an interesting one, I think. And what we're going to be talking about is how, in the late 1800s, for the most part, the United States, for the first time ever in our country's history, began to take over territories abroad, and even to, in some cases, take territories that were either fully independent nations or even possessions of other imperial powers around the world. Now, we generally, and when we look at history, we generally distinguish between this expansionism from previous examples of expansionism, such as westward expansion, manifest destiny, Louisiana Purchase, all that. But in reality, it's all part of the same trend. It's just continual expansion in the United States. What makes this unique, I guess you could say, although you could also make the counter-argument that it's not unique, but what you would say is that this, unlike other westward expansion, not only does it take us beyond the Americas, which we had never done before, but it also begins to involve us in the taking over of territories that were considered to be more legitimately independent or legitimately owned by other countries. Whereas when we looked at the West, we kind of looked at that since the beginning as just something that we were destined to have, that whole manifest destiny. But to be fair, they've also once belonged to other countries or other peoples. So we're going to be talking about imperialism, which is the practice of a more powerful country exerting control or dominance over smaller, weaker countries. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is causes, because, for the first 100 years of our existence, we saw very little in the realm of American imperialism, and then all of a sudden, it's like in the late 1800s, we were all in. Okay, and the question then becomes, well, why now? Right? Why all of a sudden? Now, are there examples of imperialism prior to the late 1800s? Yeah, there are examples. Like I said, you could maybe even liken the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession. The purchase of Alaska, I'm not going to talk about today, but that's actually one of the most important purchases we have. I think it's in your chapter this week. Alaska, anyone know? None of you read the book. Good enough. Okay, so anyways, purchase of Alaska from Russia. I know it was in the previous chapter. So, why is it that in the late 1800s, all of a sudden, the United States is really just adamant about expanding and taking new territory? All right, so cause number one is commercial and business interests. Economic, we're talking here. Okay, you will remember that at the turn of the century, the United States had emerged as a major economic and industrial power in the world. And in order to preserve that dominance, we needed to continuously expand and find new markets to exploit. Markets for resources and markets for consumers that we could then sell to. That would uphold our industrial and commercial dominance. I mean, look at the chart here. Look at exports and imports. As we progress to the turn of the century, they're rapidly increasing. In order to maintain that kind of pace of change, we're going to need more lands, more resources, more people. Okay? And under economic theory of the day, okay, expansion and new territories and things like that were essential to maintaining that economic dominance. Okay, our second big cause of imperialism is military and strategic interest. One of the reasons why nations will engage in imperialism is to expand the prestige and power of their military. Okay? There was a widely held belief in the 19th century that was largely supported by writings like this one here. There was a US military naval officer by the name of Alfred T. Mahan. He wrote a book called Influence of Sea Power in History, in which he talked about, basically the major powers of the world and how they become the dominance of the previous 150 or so years. And his big argument was the most significant factor contributing to a country's dominance over world events was naval power. He argued that if you look at history, the countries that are the greatest naval powers in the modern era are also the countries that had the greatest political power and influence over world affairs. I mean, look at Great Britain, right? Great Britain, which would probably be considered one of the greatest powers of the era, was so and was built upon their naval dominance. I mean, ever since they defeated the Spanish Armada, they had been the naval dominant country of the world. And because of that, they were also able to continue to build an empire. So according to Alfred T. Mahan, it was necessary for countries like the United States to continue to build up their navy. Now, we did so. At the turn of the century, we invested lots of money in building up our navy. We constructed an all-new, modern, steel-hulled navy, okay? Because we wanted to be able to use our military might to influence world events. And in the 1800s and the early 1900s, really, if you think about it, navies were probably the most important element of the military, because if you are going to be able to, exert influence over countries and things like that, you got to be able to reach them. And since there are no airplanes, right, or something like that, or anything of the sort, your navy is really the most important factor allowing you to wage war and really control your territories. Now, what does this have to do with imperialism, right? Well, in order to have a navy that can reach anywhere in the world and react in a timely fashion, you've got to have territory. You have to have bases. You have to have fueling depots and places to rearm. Okay, because without those, your reach of your military is very short. So what we're going to see is at the turn of the century, the United States will have an increasing desire to expand into new areas, particularly in the Pacific. All these little territories will fall under American control in some way. Okay, some of those you probably weren't even aware of. Okay, and a lot of those have a lot to do with being able to expand our military reach into new areas in Asia. Okay, but it doesn't just have to be. I mean, even we're going to talk later tomorrow, I'm getting ahead of myself, about our influence in Panama, where we have a desire to build a canal. That canal will not only help trade, but it'll also speed up the timetable by which our fleets can move around the world and react to crises. Okay, today, for example, tied to today's synthesis, right? Today, the United States maintains over 100 military bases around the world. All right? The reason being is we like to have a large reach so that we can move people and troops around and react to world events on moments' notice. Okay? So this is kind of the beginning of the United States becoming a military power in the world. We're kind of now coming into our own. All right, next up, social Darwinist thinking. Okay, one of the things that influenced American imperialism and European imperialism, or imperialism of any kind, was social Darwinism, or the idea that there was this, that things should be take their natural course, and that there was a natural hierarchy of people, and even a natural hierarchy of race. Okay, in the 19th century, there was a lot of scientific theory out there that was accepted that said that the white race and the Anglo and the Caucasian races of the Western civilizations were just a naturally superior race to others. Okay? And they tried to argue this using the social Darwinist thinking of the day, the idea that the success of Western civilization was largely attributed to the natural inherited, supremacy of the white race. Now, of course, by today's standards, we recognize this is completely false and it's racist, but it was widely accepted in the 19th century. So when they looked at race, there was just this automatic assumption in the West that those people of Caucasian descent were just naturally better. Now, how does this relate to imperialism? Well, the way it relates to imperialism is that if you think that your race or your culture even or whatever is just naturally better, okay, it allows you to impose your culture on others under the false belief that you're helping them. Okay, this should be really easy to understand because just yesterday we talked about how the United States forcibly made Native American Indians accept this American culture, right? And it was destructive to their culture, but it was done under the guise that, hey, their culture is backwards or it's uncivilized and we need to educate them. Okay, so under this kind of thinking, it was very easy for countries like the United States to make the eventual leap to say, hey, we're going to help these countries by taking them over and forcing our form of government, our form of economy, our form of religion upon them. All right. Now, an example of this, and I'll just give you a quick example that kind of shows you, is this concept that was called the white man's burden. Okay. There was this British author by the name of Rudyard Kipling that was fairly popular around the turn of the century. Anyone heard of Kipling? He's most well known for writing the Jungle Book. You know that? The movie. Okay. But he also wrote a lot of other things. He also wrote a lot of poetry. And one of the poems he wrote is called The White Man's Burden. And in the poem, this became a very wide-read, popular poem. In the poem, Kipling, who was a very staunch imperialist himself, he believed in imperialism, he argued that the white race and the nations that mostly represented that white race at the time had a duty. Okay? It was their duty to go out to these underdeveloped nations of the world and help them. Okay, he felt like these nations, these indigenous people, were less developed, they were backwards, their culture was inferior, and he argued we need to go out, he said, these countries, and we need to go out there and fix them by introducing this culture to them. Okay, even though these indigenous people had no desire to have their culture changed, they took it upon themselves to do so. Okay, so you look at this cartoon. This cartoon is an extreme example. It shows you kind of the prejudice and racism of the day. Here you have this American expeditionary guy, adventurer, and he's got this racist caricature of an African, and he's dragging this person off to the schoolhouse to be educated. So the assumption there is that because these people are different, they are inferior. Okay? And that relates to imperialism, because under that thinking, it's very easy to think taking over a country is not harming them, but it's doing them a favor. So that really did fuel things. All right. Also related to that are religious interests. This is all, these could all be part of the same category, really. As part of almost every religion, there is a desire to spread that religion and convert. Almost every religion that has ever existed has had an edict to go out and get more people into that religion. All right? And that was the same here. Okay? And this also was, an example of the spread of culture. All right? So with social Darwinism, we also saw the efforts by Americans, in this case, to spread religion, mostly Christianity, because most Americans were Christian, to new areas. This was spreading that they thought was the American culture. So we saw efforts by American missionaries everywhere. For example, here's in China. This picture, I think, sums it up very nicely. You have Christian missionaries in China. They're there to convert the Chinese to Christianity, while at the same time they're exploiting the Chinese people. Literally, in this case, they're riding on their backs. I don't think you could have a better symbolic relationship between an imperialist country and a weaker country than that. Okay, but this was true of all the major powers of Europe. If you look at this picture over here on the right, you have all these caricatures of leaders around the world. You got Uncle Sam from the United States, you got Great Britain, you got Germany, okay, and all of them were riding on the backs and the hard work of the indigenous people of their colonies, because at this time, this was the great era of imperialism. Now, this should not be new to you. You guys, I believe everyone in here last year was an AP Euro, correct? Okay, I would think you probably talked about this age in the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference. This is when the Europeans basically got together, they sat down on the map of Africa and said, okay, who wants what? And they carved up Africa, and they basically just took it apart. Okay? So everyone was playing this game. Now, what about the United States? The United States was late to the game of imperialism. We started late. Okay? Europe was way ahead of us. All right? But once we did get involved, we pushed the pace and we tried to catch up very rapidly. We're going to talk a little bit about that here today. So you should be aware of a lot of this. Okay, last cause is the closing of the American frontier. One of the theories out there, and this is a theory, it doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% true. But one of the theories is imperialism in the late 1800s was nothing more than a continuation of the Western expansion that existed prior. In 1890, the U.S. Census declared that the American frontier ceased to exist. There was no more frontier for American explorers to go and settle. So the argument here would be, well, despite the fact there was no more frontier, it's not like Americans just abandoned this expansionist ideology, manifest destiny. Rather, now they took their expansionist goals to new areas. So rather than expanding to the west, the western United States, but there is no more west, now they're going to go overseas, and they're going to try and conquer territories overseas for the first time. Okay? So what they're going to do is they're just going to keep on going on further and keep on taking on new territories out there. So that's also a pretty good idea. Especially if you think that frontier thesis we read yesterday, if you look at Turner's frontier thesis, he's arguing that the most significant factor in American history ever is the frontier. Now it's gone. I would think a guy like Turner would say, okay, if it's the most significant thing to our shaping as a people, it's not like we're going to be like, oh no, it's gone, I guess we're done expanding. That's not how we work. We're just going to, at least for a while, we're going to keep looking to expand further if we truly are this chosen people like many Americans thought they were. Okay, so now let's get into some examples of countries that we did exert imperial power over. We're going to go through a lot of them. Today we're going to go through two major examples. Now I've already mentioned some. The one I specifically mentioned was Alaska. Okay, we bought Alaska in the 1860s. Secretary of State William Seward did that. We bought that from the Russians. So that is one of the earliest examples of us engaging in foreign diplomacy and imperialism. Although, you can go back to Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession, whatever. Okay, you got lots of examples if you really want. Okay? But now in the late 19th century, we are going to once again ramp up efforts. Now, one of the first targets we have is Hawaii. Hawaii is going to be one of our first targets of imperialism. So let's first talk about the status of Hawaii prior to American annexation. So in the 19th century, Hawaii by the mid-19th century, I should say, Hawaii had largely fallen under a lot of American influence and control. Throughout the course of the 1800s, American business interests had continuously been putting money into Hawaii. Okay, Hawaii became kind of a market for American businessmen. Who was there? Well, we had farmers growing, things like fruit and sugar, and they were making a lot of money in this kind of agribusiness model. In addition, we had Christian missionaries that were over there converting the indigenous people to Christianity. So what I'm trying to say is there was a strong American presence, both in terms of people and economic influence in Hawaii. Okay? And there was so much money, American money in Hawaii, that the American government was now interested in protecting Hawaii from takeover because it would protect our interests. So what happens is by the mid-19th century, Hawaii had become what we call a protectorate. That's a good vocabulary word. A protectorate is a weaker nation who, while being independent, still its own country, it is protected and largely influenced by a much stronger country. Okay? So there's no doubt that Hawaii was a protector of the United States because we had a lot of money in it and we were using our military might to protect it from takeover from other hostile groups because it served our interests. We were protecting Hawaii because it was for our own, best benefit. Okay, so by the time we get to the late 19th century, Hawaii had become a very important place for the United States. It was a stopover for all major trade routes between the United States, the Americas, and Asia. It was absolutely essential. There was a lot of money invested in it already in terms of agriculture. Okay? And it would also have significant military strategic significance if we needed a place to, have our fleet launch from, so on and so forth. Now, the problem was in the late 19th century, many of the Hawaiian people were very upset because the country was becoming more and more increasingly dominated by the American government. Okay? For example, the Hawaiian government was a monarchy, and the last queen of Hawaii was this woman by the name of Queen Liliuokalani. And she was very much concerned about the influence of the American government and money in her country. And she had always said that she wanted to establish a Hawaii for the Hawaiian people. She wanted the Hawaiian people to run Hawaiian affairs, free from American influence. Now that kind of stuff right there, that concerned many American businessmen who had invested in Hawaii because they didn't want to hear that kind of stuff. They wanted to make sure that they continued to have their money being made in Hawaii. So we're going to see some action by these business interests. So in 1890, this is where it gets a little complex. In 1890, the McKinley Tariff was passed. Okay, the McKinley Tariff was a tax on foreign goods. Goods shipped from Hawaii were foreign because it's a foreign country. All right, that meant American businesses in Hawaii had to pay more money in taxes to sell their goods in the United States. All right, so they were losing money because of this tariff. Now they were losing so much money that they decided to act. Now one way to bypass the tariff is to simply become part of the country you're selling to, and then they're no longer a foreign country, and you don't have to pay the taxes anymore. So what happened was these American businessmen used their power and influence, as well as the help of some American troops that were stationed in Hawaii. They had a little help. And they actually staged a coup in which they actually overthrew the existing Hawaiian government. They took over the country for themselves, American businessmen, on their own. So they deposed the queen, and they proclaimed that Hawaii was now a republic, an independent republic, in which the leaders of which were these American businessmen. Okay, the leader of this movement was a guy by the name of Sanford Dole, who you might guess is related sort of to the Dole Food Company, right? Because of course Hawaii had a lot of food agriculture, so you can kind of see the connection between business, agriculture, and politics. Okay? So now Hawaii is independent. Now immediately these businessmen begin petitioning for the United States to annex Hawaii. They want the United States to annex Hawaii. And for a few years, the United States kind of dragged its feet and was unsure what to do. President Cleveland was adamantly opposed to this kind of imperialism. He did try to oppose it for as long as he could. But by 1898, we had a new president, and the kind of view of imperialism had changed. So in 1898, Hawaii was annexed under President McKinley, who was probably our most imperialist president ever, arguably. And we gained new territory. So Hawaii became an American territory. Is it a state? No, not yet. It's just an American territory. Okay? But now that it's American, that means all of the trade between Hawaii and the United States is considered domestic, which means you don't have to pay the tariff. So these businessmen managed to literally overthrow a country to save a few bucks. Yeah.
So what happened to the queen after it was overthrown?
She was out of power. She remained there as kind of a symbolic figure, and is still even today very much in Hawaii revered in Hawaiian culture. But she was no longer an actual leader of her country. That was it. Yeah.
Which president was it?
McKinley is the one that was in office when it was finally annexed. Like when you think McKinley, and this is important, you know, President McKinley, the first thing you need to think of when you think McKinley is imperialism. He is the president in office when we become really an imperial power. That's probably his biggest claim to fame. And you might remember, I told you before, how in the Gilded Age there was that long run of what we call the forgettable presidents, you know, the ones that there's really not, what did they do, right? That run ends with McKinley. McKinley is very different in the sense that under his presidency, we see dramatic things happen in American history that are worthy of note. So we're kind of going back into a time period when the presidents will become more prominent in politics. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So that's Hawaii. Any questions on Hawaii? Everyone got that? Pretty easy. All right, now we're going to talk about Cuba, as well as some other territories. All right. Now, you might remember the last time we talked about Cuba, it was the 1850s, and we talked about that half-hearted attempt by the South to take control of Cuba. Right? They were going to buy Cuba from Spain, and if Spain said no, we were going to go to war. This was known as, there we go, Austin Manifesto. Okay, but it didn't happen, right? So Cuba was still, by 1898, Cuba was still under the control of Spain, which was still a pretty prominent world power. All right. Now the problem was, by 1898, Cuba had fallen into kind of, anarchy in the sense that the Cuban people didn't want to be part of the Spanish Empire anymore. They wanted independence. There was a growing Cuban independence movement in Cuba. Now Spain was not okay with it. Spain was not going to let Cuba go. So they were doing everything in their power to hold on to Cuba as one of their colonies. So the Spanish government sent to Cuba troops with the purpose of subduing this revolution, if you want to call it. Okay? So there was a lot of violence and kind of anarchy going on in Cuba over this kind of independence movement. APC, this is an American cartoon in which the Cuban people were the ones suffering. Here they are frying in the frying pan of Spanish misrule. All right? Now Americans were very quick to take note of what was going on in Cuba. We couldn't ignore Cuba. The reason we can't ignore Cuba is because it's right there, right? Cuba is one of our closest neighbors. It's 90 miles away from Florida. Okay? What happens in Cuba could have possible ramifications for us due to proximity. All right? And as we are going to see for the next... There you go. As we're going to see for the next 100 years, Cuba is actually going to continually play an important role in American history. So Cuba, we think of as a small little country. Cuba is very influential in terms of our history, and this is one of the reasons why. Okay, so Americans were very concerned what was going on in Cuba. One, because of proximity, but two, just in terms of humanitarian reasons. We were worried about the Cuban people, and there is a natural tendency of the United States to sympathize with any weaker group fighting for their independence. Why? Because, of course, we once did that ourselves. So usually when there's a group campaigning for their independence, we tend to side in favor of independence. Not always. If the group wanting independence is a group that we don't have, ties with, or they're bad for us, we won't support them. So we don't always support independence, but we will when it's a case like this. All right, now, what was making the American people particularly concerned was the treatment of the Cuban people by the Spanish government. News was coming out of Cuba that the Spanish government was using very heavy-handed tactics on the Cuban people. One of those tactics was there was a Spanish general by the name of Valeriano Weyler, who they nicknamed the Butcher Weyler, which will give you kind of an idea what he was like. And he was rounding up Cuban dissidents and putting them into what were called reconcentration camps, which is really just another way of saying prison camps. And the conditions within these prison camps were deplorable. People were starving, as the pictures show. They were dying of disease in droves. It was a bad deal, okay? And pictures like this, stories like this were getting out and being in the United States. And of course, Americans were outraged because our fellow Cuban neighbors were being mistreated by what we felt was this oppressive imperial power. This should sound kind of familiar. You know, that's how we felt about England, that they were mistreating us. Not to this degree, but they were in some ways mistreating our rights. So Americans definitely sympathized with the Cuban people. They wanted independence, and they were, of course, being subjected to these humanitarian concerns. Now, compounding American concern for the Cuban people was the job of the press, okay? In the 19th century, pretty much every American got their news from one source, newspapers, right? Where else are you going to go? Okay, there were no TVs, there's no radio, there's no internet. So pretty much every American got their news from newspapers. So newspapers pretty much were the media source. And because they were the sole media source, Americans were very heavily influenced by newspapers. You know, today, you can get your news from all these different sources. And some are more objective than others, but you can always cross-reference and really find out the truth if you want, okay? So you don't have to always worry about the bias in media. You know, people talk about bias in media, and sure there is bias in media always, but it's a little overblown. People talk about it like everything is a lie. You can pretty much get to the truth if you really want to, okay? A little bit harder in the 19th century because really you just had these newspapers. And to make it even worse, most of the newspapers in the United States were controlled by two major publishers. Okay, you got this guy Joseph Pulitzer, you got another guy William Randolph Hearst, both very famous men. They were the major media moguls of the day. They controlled most of the media and the newspapers. Now, they could then control really public opinion because if they wanted to manipulate the public, what they printed in their newspapers would do so because there weren't alternative sources. All right. Now, what they engaged in was something called yellow journalism. This is an important vocabulary word for this week. Yellow journalism was the technique that still exists, but was more prevalent then, of exaggerating or sensationalizing the news to make it sell better, okay, or get more readers, or even to sway public opinion in some direction. So what are we talking about here? Well, you know, when they published their stories, they would make sure to make them as juicy as possible. So rather than have a headline that says something like, you know, Spanish government imprisons Cuban dissidents, thousands die, they might say butcher, whaler, massacres women and children in cold blood, you know, genocide. I mean, they'll really, the language they use will be much more colorful to make people go, oh, okay, that sounds, I want to read that. Okay, so that kind of example of yellow journalism, or even journalism where let's say they had an intended desire, they wanted to make the American public feel a way. They could literally manufacture the news. You know, there's this famous quote, this is very well known. William Randolph first said this to one of his photographers that was taking pictures in Cuba, this guy Frederick Remington. He said, if you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. What he's saying there is, look, you give me good pictures that I can put in my paper, I can make this country go to war. This is a newspaper man talking about getting the country going to war. And war would be good for business because people like to read the news when things are happening. So, is it necessarily the right thing to do? No. But this is what happened, okay? Now, the other thing that was fueling American desire for action and war in general, like you see, there they are, they're pushing for war, was Jingoism. That's another term that we still use today. Jingoism is this idea of extreme nationalism, extreme national pride, okay, and also the belief in, like, you know, very much an extreme aggressive foreign policy. You know, Jingoism is kind of this idea that, you know, we're the greatest, everyone else is inferior, our way is always right, and if we want something in the world, we can take it by force if we want. Okay, it's a very aggressive, nationalistic way of thinking. Okay, and it's not unheard of. I mean, we still have Jingoism today. Okay, I said to the other class the other day, I said, Jingoism has made a big splash in the current presidential race. You know, some of the candidates would definitely, I think, be categorized as jingoistic in some of the stuff they say, the very aggressive, militaristic, and we're the best, we gotta go get everyone who's not us. That's kind of jingoistic, and that was very common back in the 19th century, okay? So this kind of stuff was pushing the nation closer and closer to war, because Americans were so fed up with what Spain was doing, they were demanding that we step in and do something. All right, now, pushing us even further to war was an incident of national insult. The Spanish ambassador to the United States was this guy named Lome. And he wrote a letter back home to the Spanish government in which he, when it was leaked out, the letter got leaked out to the American press, he criticized the US government, and he also specifically criticized our president, President McKinley, at the time. So when this letter got leaked out and hit the press, Americans were outraged. They said, how dare Spain, in this case, their representative, criticize us? And we were particularly sensitive right now because we were so focused on what Spain was doing in Cuba, everything Spain did could be perceived as a national insult. Okay, so you look at the quote there, he said he called McKinley weak and bitter for the admiration of the crowd, and later on he referred to him as trying to play up the Jingos, the Jingoists of his party. Now that's not that terrible a thing to say, but when you're already on bad terms with the country, it just adds more fuel to the fire. So after the Lome Letter, more and more Americans once again were saying, look, we've got to go to war. This is a national insult. They insulted our president. And Americans took that very seriously. Okay? So the desire to go to war is getting more and more intense. Now, can we go to war over just a letter? No. Okay? But it did, once again, it's like everything now that Spain did was perceived as some kind of sneaky maneuver or stab in the back. So any little thing could set us off and push us over the top to war. So here it is. In 1898, the United States government sent down to Cuba a warship by the name of the USS Maine. Now the purpose of this was to intimidate. Okay, we weren't going to war yet. We sent the Maine down to Cuba because we were trying to show we were demonstrating a show of force to the Spanish government. Say, look, we're watching you. Here's one of our modern naval warships. This is the kind of thing that you're going to have to deal with if you do the wrong thing. So this practice is generally referred to as gunboat diplomacy. That's the actual name of it. It just so happens in this case it actually used a gunboat. Okay, gunboat diplomacy is the practice of countries using a show of force to try and achieve some kind of political means or to influence or whatever. Okay, we do this all the time. America's very much guilty of doing this. For example, was it last week? I guess it was last week. North Korea, their news. What they do? They set off a nuclear bomb. So what did we do? A few days later, we flew one of our long-range bombers, which is capable of delivering a nuclear bomb, real close to the border between South Korea and North Korea. Now, did that have any practical purpose? No, but it was a high-profile flyby because it's kind of like, look, if you continue to engage in these practices that will push us to the brink of war, you need to be aware that we have the capability to strike back. It's completely an intimidating factor. That's what it is. We do it all the time. Okay? And that's what this was. It was like, look, Spain, look what we have. Don't mess around. Yes?
What year?
1898. Okay? Now, here's the next part. So the Maine is sitting down there in Cuba, and then one night, mysteriously, it just blows up, like the picture shows. Okay? And hundreds of Americans are killed, and there's an immediate outcry from the American public for revenge, because the Americans are sure this has to have been the work of Spain. Yeah.
Was it in Cuba, like the territory?
It was in Cuba, Havana Harbor. Okay? So now we blame Spain. Spain immediately came back and said, we had nothing to do with this. But we're like, oh no, we're not falling for it. You did it, you just won't admit it. Okay? So because of the Maine disaster, there is a rallying cry amongst the American people for war. Okay? The famous phrase that was said in support of war was, remember the Maine and to hell with Spain. Kind of like remember the Alamo, right? And look at the cartoon. Prime example of yellow journalism. You got the bloody Spanish monster standing on the grave of the dead sailors murdered by Spain. I mean, that's not, a piece of media that's intended to influence you, I don't know what is.
Okay, so was it ever proved that it was?
Okay, so there's the inevitable question. Was Spain guilty? So, we didn't know at the time. In the 1970s, we went back with submarines and modern technology, and we sent down divers, and we looked at the wreck. And they used modern forensic technology and science, and they looked at it. And the conclusion they came up with was the ship blew up from an explosion within, and it was most likely, in all certainty, an accident.
Maybe.
Now, the question is then, if we had had that knowledge, would we still have avoided war? We don't know. I would probably say war was inevitable. The American people had pretty much made up their mind before the Maine. I mean, the Maine sealed the deal. There was no question. There was no going back. But even before the Maine, there was intense pressure on the government to go to war. The majority of the American people wanted war. And what the American people want, they usually get when it comes to things like that. So, probably Spain was not guilty in that. All right, so, as I said, the United States did declare war in 1898. All right, this will be our first foreign war in a while. And we, of course, immediately began making preparations because we were not prepared initially right off the bat, at least in terms of an invasion. Now, here's the thing. Everyone expected that the war would initially take place in Cuba, which is where the focus was on. And, of course, we knew that. So we decided to shock the Spanish by doing something that they would have never expected. And what we did is we had our Asiatic fleet stationed out of Hong Kong, which was our naval fleet in Asia, and we ordered it to go directly to the Philippines. Now why? The Philippines was also Spanish territory. And we had our fleet there engage in a battle with the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, in which we pretty much destroyed the majority of the Spanish fleet in Asian waters. All right, this was a huge victory. This was probably the most significant victory of the war. And it also opened the door later for us to invade and occupy the Philippines, which we did do. The war in the Philippines did eventually break out. We invaded along with the assistance of the Filipino people. The Filipino people rose up in insurrection against Spain and joined us in our fight. Okay, now this is really important. We had not expected to be so successful here. The success in the Philippines, when the war does come to an end, which I'll get to here shortly, when the war does come to an end, we're kind of like sitting in the Philippines, we're like, okay, well, we've got this territory, what do we do with it now? We didn't expect this, we can't give it back. You know? Do we keep it, or do we give it to the Filipinos and say, hey, look, you guys are free? This was a real dilemma. We had never had this problem before. We had never accidentally taken territory in a war. So it's going to be a real concern. All right, so there you see it. The big hero of this battle that made the name for himself, at least in terms of the naval battle, was this guy named Admiral Dewey. Okay, Admiral Dewey and our Asiatic fleet. As you can see, the headline, Dewey smashes Spain's fleet. And it talks about how the Spanish fleet was completely outmatched. Their ships were still very antiquated. Many of their ships were still made of just wood like the old days. Our ships are the modern steel-hulled warships that are going to be appearing in the 20th century. So because of that, it was really just a lopsided battle. Now, following the defeat in the Philippines, we then followed up with an invasion of Cuba. Okay, we did launch an invasion force from Florida. We did invade Cuba. Okay, and there we had a hard time with it. Now, we didn't have a hard time because of the battle. We had a hard time because we were not prepared for the climate, the mosquitoes, and our lack of supplies. More Americans died in this war from disease, dehydration, okay, and things like that than died in actual combat, by far. Okay, so combat was not even close to being the #1 killer in this war. It was our own inexperience and ineptitude. You know, our guys were wearing these heavy wool uniforms invading Cuba in the summer. And they chronically had problems. People were passing out because they couldn't keep clean drinking water to the front lines. So it taught us a lesson that in war, you can be gung-ho and want to fight as hard as you want, but you can only fight as hard as you have the supply line, the logistics to fund and keep that war going, which we did not have yet. Okay? Now, Battle of Manila Bay is probably the most important battle of the war, in my opinion. But it's also, it doesn't get nowhere near as much attention as this battle, which is far less significant. The Battle of San Juan Hill is usually the most celebrated battle of the war. It involved a frontal assault up a hill to a fort in which the Spanish were dug in on elevated ground. It was a very brave assault, and it was, of course, an American victory. The Spanish were completely outnumbered and outgunned. But the real reason why this is so famous, it really has nothing to do with the course of the war. The war was going to be an American victory no matter what. We pretty much were in control from the beginning. The reason why this was so famous is because who participated. Now, one of the groups who led the charge at Stonewall Hill was a group of cavalrymen called the Rough Riders. Okay, they were supposed to be on horseback, but their horses never made it to Cuba, so they went on foot, which is fine. They were trained to both. Now, the Rough Riders were this kind of colorful group of people. Many of the people were ex-cowboys and things like that, because they had skills on horseback and with guns. But one of the leaders of the Rough Riders was Theodore Roosevelt. Now, he made a name for himself here, and he basically becomes the president all by virtue of this one moment. Theodore Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. All right, I'm almost done, so let's wait and then finish it.
Students have items to be picked up in the front office after the bell rings.
It's a pretty neat story.
Tia Tamakari, Dak Santana, Doc Armstrong,
Send
and
the
England.
Fort Samuel Hill.
Please
I do
come
not
to the
know.
front office after the bell rings. Thank you.
This is actually in Cuba. It says San Juan, which is Puerto Rico. It's actually a Cuban battle. Isn't that weird?
Well, there's like a fort in Puerto Rico.
There was fighting in Puerto Rico as well, so it's probably related to that. You're absolutely right. Okay, let me just real quick finish this story. So, Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's a high position. Like, he was like the #2 guy in our government for the Navy. When the war broke out, Roosevelt, who was kind of this like adventurous guy, he liked to go on hunting safari, and he was kind of a tough guy. He resigned his prestigious position because he wanted to go fight. He was ecstatic. This is the guy, he said, I want to go experience combat. And he even later on in his memoir said that it was the most thrilling experience of his life to have people shooting at him. So I guess he's a little crazy too. So when he did this and made a name for himself, he was also personally involved in the Battle of Stonewall Hill. He was part of the leader of the Rough Riders. He took this famous photograph of the Rough Riders at the top of the hill. He made a really big name for himself. Now, why does that matter? Well, later on, when McKinley runs for re-election, he needs a vice president who will help him win the election. So he chooses Roosevelt under the assumption that this crazy guy, this cowboy, he's like a cowboy, will never be president. But what ends up happening is Roosevelt will become president because McKinley will be assassinated, and then everyone's shocked to see this guy get to become president. But he actually turned out to be one of our best, in my opinion. All right, last thing. The war does end. I told you we were in command from the beginning to end. One American official called it the Splendid Little War. That tells you how seriously we took this. Okay? You don't usually hear wars referred to as splendid. Okay? So the Treaty of Paris ends the war, and it does a lot for us. This is actually one of the most important victories in American history because of what it gave us. It changed everything. This is a turning point in American history. So I want you to know that 1898 is a pivotal year. Okay? I don't ask you to know a lot of years. I think you should know 1898 for a lot of reasons. Not only is it the war's year, but it's the year we became an imperialist power. So what did we get? We got Cuba free from Spanish rule. Now, does that mean Cuba's ours? Not necessarily. Does it mean Cuba's free? From who? Well, it's free from Spain. Is it free from us? Not necessarily. So Cuba is still in limbo right now. We don't know what's going to happen with Cuba. I'll have an answer for that tomorrow. But Cuba is free from Spanish rule. We will see what happens with Cuba. Spain also gave us Puerto Rico and Guam. Puerto Rico and Guam actually became American territories. They are still American territories today. Okay? People, Puerto Rico and Guam are American citizens. And they have all the rights today. They have all the rights and protections of American citizens. Back then, not necessarily. I'll get to that later. We bought the Philippines. We kind of said, well, we're here. We can't give it back because that would not, be victory. So we purchased the Philippines, but we did not say what we were going to do with them. This outraged the Filipino people. Guess what? They turned on us. So immediately after we defeated Spain, we now started to fight the Filipino people because they wanted us out there because they had been under the false pretenses that they were going to be liberated. They were not liberated. Not yet. Lastly, if you had to sum it all up, the Treaty of Paris 1898 is what ushered us into the imperialist American age. It made us an imperial power, it made us a world power, and it made us a military power. We had defeated one of the old European powers in very easy fashion. This proved we were entering into the new era of the 20th century as one of the dominant countries on earth. So I cannot stress this enough. I want you to hear what I'm saying. This is a turning point in American history. You need to know the year, you need to know the event. Okay? Okay, so yesterday we left off, we were talking about the Spanish-American War and all the territories we got, and of course Hawaii before that. So one of the big questions that came up is how would the role of the United States change? And now that we were getting more and more involved with world affairs, would we continue on? Would we continue on with imperialism? And more importantly, what would become of the indigenous people of these territories? Okay, the real big question was, now that we've taken these new territories, would these people become citizens? Would they become states? Would they get the same rights and privileges that other American citizens get? And there was no answer to these questions yet, since we had really never done anything like this before. In our history, every time we had taken a territory, it had been with the express purpose of making that territory states and giving the people there the same rights and privileges as American citizens, for the most part. Not everyone, many. All right. So the fact that we're taking foreign territory and bringing these foreign people under United States control left a lot of question marks about what we were going to do with them. And we'll get to those here shortly. Okay. Now, for example, in the Philippines, okay, as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States had gained the Philippines. And the people of the Philippines were now wondering, well, what becomes of us? And many of them were upset because when the United States first came to the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, we were welcomed as liberators. People believed that we were there to give the Philippines its freedom from Spanish rule. And then when the war was over, what they realized was not only were they not getting their independence, they were just trading the Spanish for now American rule. Okay, and people like Emilio Aguinaldo was a Filipino revolutionary who actually now began organizing resistance against American rule. The Filipino people now began actually fighting against the Americans because they had not yet been given their independence, and they had hoped that independence would come as a result of the Spanish-American War. So following the Spanish-American War, we now began trying to suppress revolts in the Philippines against American rule. And then we would continue having resistance against American rule all the way up and through the 20th century until, of course, the Philippines did get its freedom following World War II. All right, now you look here, additionally, as a result of the Spanish-American War and other things, okay, our sphere of influence, or the area that was directly under American control or American influence, had grown. You can see the American eagle here. Its wingtip stretches far out as the Philippines, all the way to the United States and down south, even as far as Panama, which we're going to talk about here shortly. So our empire had grown significantly. We were now at the largest we had ever been as a country. And there's another cartoon, here you go, showing McKinley. McKinley, who may have been our most imperialist president. There he is with Uncle Sam, looking at all the territories that the United States was interested in taking, of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii. Okay, so this just kind of shows you the mentality at the time of McKinley was one of national expansion. Now, did everyone agree with imperialism? No. Many Americans were opposed to the idea of imperialism. Okay, the reason being is many Americans saw that imperialism did not really fit in line with the American way of things. The American spirit of democracy and freedom and self-determination. Taking over countries and not extending the same rights and privileges to the people of those countries did not seem to be fitting within the American ideal. So many people were very critical of imperialism. We had the American Anti-Imperialist League, which was an organization that was opposed to the annexation of new territories. Had some very prominent members. You look at Mark Twain, the author, probably one of the most prominent American authors in history. Andrew Carnegie, okay, the business tycoon. William James Bryan, presidential candidate. Okay, so there were many people who were also opposed to imperialism because they believed it violated the spirit of what this country was all about. And they campaigned against the annexation of the Philippines and other territories. Okay, so not everyone was in agreement on imperialism, although it is probably true to say that most Americans did not really have a big problem with imperialism, the United States taking more territory, because they knew that it would empower us, enrich us. Okay, and since most people were in favor of that, they were okay with it. But there were people who were opposed to imperialism. But for the most part, their views were not shared by the government, and we were going to go ahead with imperialism throughout the early 20th century. All right, now let's get into some details about specific territories. I got a lot of details on Cuba. Now, Cuba was really interesting because Cuba, as a result of the Spanish-American War, did not become American territory. Cuba was expected to become independent. Okay, and even before the Spanish-American War was over, the United States had agreed to something called the Teller Amendment. And what the Teller Amendment said was that when the Spanish-American War did finally conclude, Cuba would be given its independence. Now, when the Spanish-American War did finally come to an end, Cuba was not immediately given its independence. We were committed to the idea of Cuban independence. However, we were not ready to give Cuba its independence immediately. Okay, and when we finally did give Cuba its independence, it came with some conditions. All right, so we didn't take Cuba over like we took over Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines. However, we did extend our influence over Cuba. All right, so in 1903, we passed what was called the Platt Amendment, which followed up the Teller Amendment. The Platt Amendment would allow Cuba to get its independence, but it put rules on Cuba. It basically said Cuba had to follow these rules if it wanted to keep and maintain its independence. So we put stipulations upon Cuban independence and said, look, you got to follow these rules or you can't be independent, free. All right, so what were some of the rules we put on Cuba? Okay, number one, Cuba was not allowed to enter into any agreements with foreign powers that would endanger its independence. In other words, we did not want Cuba making deals with other countries that might somehow lead to Cuba being taken over by those countries. We wanted Cuba to remain independent and free from foreign influence. We didn't want other countries coming in and sticking their nose in Cuban business because that might affect us. If something was going on in Cuba that might threaten their independence, the United States said that we reserve the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Now, this is a big deal. We were basically telling Cuba, look, if you do anything that we don't like, we have the right to come in and actually change that. So we were giving them their independence, but it was limited independence. We're like, well, we're going to be watching you, making sure you're on the, doing the right things. All right? And those first 2 points were really in line with the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine said that to European powers, you're not allowed to come over here and start taking over countries anymore. We were worried that Cuba might one day be taken over or dominated by a European power. So we were saying, look, you can't do that. Okay? Number 3, Cuba would have to give us a military base, which we established at a place called Guantanamo Bay. So we established a military base at Guantanamo Bay. It is still there today. Okay, we have a military base on Cuban soil, despite the fact that our relationship with Cuba over the years has been rocky. We do have a military base there. We've had it there since 1903. Okay, and it's been in the news quite a bit the last 15 years or so, because of course Guantanamo Bay is where we also hold all our detainees in the war on terror. People who are captured, suspected of terrorism, are held at Guantanamo Bay. And there's been a lot of criticism because, of course, we've held them there without trial indefinitely. There's been torture that's been used against them that people have been critical of. So Guantanamo Bay's been in the news a lot. So you should be familiar with what Guantanamo Bay is. You need to know that. All right, and lastly, Cuba was not allowed to build up an excessive public debt. It means they weren't allowed to owe countries a lot of money. And that goes back to the first 2 points. Is we did not want Cuba getting into debt with other countries because then they might come over and try to control Cuba if they didn't get paid back on time. And that would violate the Monroe Doctrine. So keep that Monroe Doctrine in mind, because we're going to be talking about more about it here in a minute. Remember the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. Us saying to Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. This is our territory. Don't mess around. If Cuba were to enter into agreements with foreign powers, it could violate the Monroe Doctrine and we would be forced to act. So basically, long story short, we were going to give Cuba its independence. However, we were going to keep them on a very short leash to make sure that they weren't doing anything that we disagreed with. So you're going to notice a trend here. At the turn of the century, going into the early 20th century, the United States is changing. One of the changes we're making is we're becoming more international and we're becoming more interventionist. It means we're involving ourselves with the affairs of other countries more and more. Okay, this was new. Today, you guys are all well aware, the United States is very involved in foreign affairs. We're always intervening, or with other countries and things like that. Okay, this is where that all began. We didn't really mess around with other countries too much until about the turn of the century. So it's only been the last about 100 or so years that the United States has taken on this new international role in the world. All right, so let's talk about Puerto Rico briefly. We did talk about Puerto Rico yesterday, so I don't have a whole lot more to say. But Puerto Rico, of course, we gained Puerto Rico in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. You already know that. And for a time period, Puerto Rico kind of was in limbo, wasn't really sure what it was, until 1917 with the Jones Act, as it was called. We granted to Puerto Rico full territorial status, which means Puerto Rico became an official territory of the United States. Okay? Which it still remains today. It's still a territory of the United States. Unlike Cuba, we still retain possession of Puerto Rico. Okay? So there you see Uncle Sam giving Puerto Rico the American clothes, representing bringing it into the United States. However, despite it becoming a territory, it does not become a state. And it's still not a state today. Now, one of the big questions was back then, with all these new territories, which, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, do the people that live in these new territories have the same rights and same privileges as American citizens living in the United States? Now, back then, that was a big question because we had never had this before. We had never had where we had taken over foreign peoples like this. And that was a big question. Do they deserve the same rights and protections that are guaranteed to Americans under the Constitution? This is something that we had to address. And we did so in a series of court cases known as the Insular Cases, which you definitely want to know this. In the Insular Cases, the United States, in a series of court cases, came to a decision as to whether people living in U.S. territories have the same rights and privileges and protections as Americans do under the Constitution. And the answer at the time period was no, they do not. Citizens of territories at the turn of the century did not get granted the same rights that you and I have. Now that has changed over the years, and today that is no longer the case. But at the time, it was decided that these people who lived in these new territories did not deserve the same rights and protections as the rest of American citizens. Which you can see from this cartoon. You got all the indigenous people of these new territories sitting up front, and Uncle Sam watching them closely, whereas the rest of the students in the back, are free from supervision. Okay. All right, so this indicates just how the United States, there was a double standard. We did not treat territorial citizens the same as we treated American citizens. Okay, now that will change over time, but at the time that was the case. And it makes sense because it fit in line with our behavior, with how we treated other indigenous people we conquered. What indigenous people did we conquer already that we had treated differently? Native Americans. If you look at this cartoon, look very closely, you got Puerto Rico, all these people. If you look at the back, you see the Native American child sitting off by himself in the corner. Okay? So this cartoon is very much pointing out how we mistreated groups of these territories that we took over. We did not treat them the same as, say, our native-born, particularly white citizens. Okay? So we were not going to treat them the same. It would take a long time for that to change. All right. Well, let's talk about Panama. We haven't talked about Panama yet. So far, what have we talked about? Hawaii, Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, Philippines. Well, let's talk about Panama. Now, Panama was a territory that the United States had been interested in since the mid-1800s. We had been interested in Panama for a long time. The reason we were interested in Panama was we had an interest in building a canal there. The purpose of which is if we could build a canal in Panama, it would greatly speed up the ability to move goods and people and our military between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. This way we would not have to sail all the way around South America, which was very time-consuming and dangerous. Okay? So for years, we had wanted to develop a canal in Panama. However, we never really got the opportunity to do so until the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, I'll just simplify this so you can read about it. But in the early 1900s, the people of Panama, which were at the time under the control of the country of Colombia, were trying to fight for their independence against Colombia. And the United States decided that we were going to intervene and help the Panamanian people in their revolution. But in exchange for our help, what do you think we wanted? Well, we wanted the rights to build a canal. So we helped Panama declare independence in exchange for the rights, under a treaty, 1903, to build a canal in Panama that we would have exclusively the rights to. We would get our canal. Panamanian independence brought the United States the ability to build a canal, which will be known, of course, as the Panama Canal. So there it is. Panama gave us the rights to build a canal in this section of Panama, the purple section there, that was the canal zone. And we began construction in 1904. Now this was a huge engineering feat. It took years and hundreds of lives. People died doing this. Okay, it was very dangerous, building something like this. Of course, there was also a lot of problems with disease and bugs down in the canal zone. But we were willing to pay that price because this canal would dramatically change the ability to move ships around the world. And of course, we needed a canal more than ever because we needed our Navy. Our Navy had to be able to respond and reach our territories in the Pacific quickly if we were going to maintain them. How would we protect our Pacific territories if we could not move our Navy back and forth between the oceans at will? So this canal was not only essential for trade, but it was also essential for military and security reasons. So this was a big deal. Okay, you can see the negotiation and the construction of Panama Canal was all carried out under the leadership of President Theodore Roosevelt, that we'll be talking about more in the coming weeks. Teddy Roosevelt, pretty important guy. Now, in addition to that, under Roosevelt, we began to become more interventionists in the affairs of Latin America. It wasn't just Panama. This is really a big deal for today's notes. Okay? In 1905, President Roosevelt, this is one of his most famous things, so I would certainly know this, put this on your card. President Roosevelt in 1905 issued something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt Corollary. What is that? It was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, kind of like he clarified it a little bit more. Now let's go back to the Monroe Doctrine for a minute. And you don't have to write down this quote, okay? But I would probably know this part right here, international police power. The Monroe Doctrine said in 1823 to Europe that the Americas is settled. You don't need to try and come over here and colonize anymore. You don't need to come over here and try and take anything over. If you do, you're going to deal with us. Okay? The Monroe Doctrine was a warning to Europe, stay out of America's affairs. Okay? Now, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine was Roosevelt adding on to that, saying that if, and I'll read this quote here in a second, but if countries in our own hemisphere are misbehaving, so countries in Latin America or wherever are misbehaving, it is the United States' duty to police those countries, and no one else. In other words, Roosevelt was claiming the power of the United States to be the policeman of the entire Western Hemisphere. We alone have the authority to intervene in the affairs of other countries if they do wrong. Or, as he put it, we have the power of an international police power, international police force. Now, what does that mean? What he means is if countries are doing anything that we consider wrong, the United States reserves the right to intervene in those countries and prevent that from happening. Now, why did he do this? You have to know what was going on at the time. At the time, a lot of countries in Latin America were borrowing money heavily from Europe and going into debt, and they were unable to pay back Europe. And European countries were threatening that if they didn't get paid back, they were going to come over and they were going to essentially take over these countries. For example, if you look at the cartoon there, there's this little island called Santo Domingo. It had borrowed money from England. England wanted to get paid back, and England said, if you don't pay us back, we're going to come over, we're going to take over your ports and take money out however we want. Now, if that happens, think about it. If European countries come over and start taking over, they're violating the Monroe Doctrine, are they not? They're coming over and they're taking over countries, which we already said you can't do. So what Roosevelt said is, look, if these countries do wrong, like they don't pay back their debts, we'll handle it for you. For example, Roosevelt said, we'll go collect your debts for you. Now you may think, oh, that's really nice of us. The United States is like, hey, we're going to be debt collectors just because we're, so nice? No, it had nothing to do with being nice. By collecting the debts for these countries, we were ensuring that they would stay on their side of the world and we would stay on ours. Okay? But over the years, here's the key, over the next 100 years or so, okay, even to today, the United States, invoking the Roosevelt Corollary and the Monroe Doctrine, will constantly intervene in the affairs of Latin American countries. Okay, stuff that you probably never even heard of, but we're going to talk about. So, on a regular basis, whenever countries in Latin America did things that we didn't like, it was not uncommon for the United States to go in there and actually do things to fix the situation for ourselves. So what am I talking about? Well, we overthrew governments, we had leaders killed, replaced them with our own leaders. We've been very, very much involved in the affairs of Latin America. And so, like I said, a lot of stuff is stuff that Americans don't even know about. So if you ever wonder why in many Latin American countries there is a lot of anti-US sentiment, I don't know if you've ever noticed in the news and things like protests and things like that, or some of the comments by world leaders. A lot of it has to do with our history of sticking our nose into the affairs of Latin American business under the authority of the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary. Okay? So we'll talk more about this as we go throughout the year. There's a lot of good examples. We talk about Cuba, Guatemala. The list goes on. We've been very much involved in Latin American affairs, and that has not made us very popular in the world, unfortunately. Okay? But anyway, so here's another cartoon, very famous cartoon, also showing Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy phrase he liked to use. He used to say, speak softly but carry a big stick. Meaning, use diplomacy, use words, but if that doesn't work, you need to have a big military to back up what you're saying. Okay, and then you see him dragging our ships around like debt collectors, collecting all the debts for all the nations that are in debt in order to uphold the Roosevelt Corollary. So the United States was very much becoming involved with world affairs, something we had never done before to this point. Let's talk about China now. Okay, we were also very much involved with China. Now, unlike the other territories, we did not take over China. However, we were very much involved there, but so was the rest of the world. At the turn of the century, China was one of the most coveted areas to do business. There was a lot of resources in China, a lot of people to sell to, and every country in the world wanted to get involved in business and trade in China, including the United States. However, there was a fear at the turn of the century that one country may try to dominate China and shut all the others out, and that could eventually lead to a war. No one wanted that. So the United States proposed this idea called the open door policy. We didn't ask, we just did it. We said, this is the way it's going to be. And guess what? The world actually listened. It shows you our newfound strength that we had after the Spanish-American War. Everyone was kind of taking note of us now, like, oh, the United States, they got some clout now. We got to listen to them. Okay? They're no longer these weaklings that they once were. So our Secretary of State was this guy named John Hay, and he proposed this thing called the open door policy. What was the open door policy? The open door policy is exactly what it sounds like. It was a policy that would mean the door to China would remain open. No country was allowed to close off China and say, hey, this is our territory, you can only China can do business with us. The open door policy said everyone could do business with China. In other words, all of the countries, like the ones on the map here, like France, Britain, Germany, Japan, Russia, and the United States, could do business with China. We could all equally exploit Chinese resources to our benefit. Now this, benefited us and it benefited them. The only people who really didn't benefit from the open door policy were probably the Chinese. Because at the time, China was so dominated by foreign interests that the Chinese people were barely running their own country. Okay? But anyways, this is just another involvement of us being involved in imperialism. In this case, we weren't directly taking over a country, but we were also, what we were actually doing, we were exerting our influence in China, as well as other countries were doing it as well. But no one country. So our influence in the world now extended all the way as far as Asia, China, Philippines, Latin America, Panama. I mean, we were everywhere. We were everywhere with our influence. So this is, like I said, this is new stuff. We had never, think about what you've learned this year up to this point. Since 1776, we had, for the most part, stayed out of the affairs of the world, with the exception of when we had to go to war with foreign powers because of whatever reasons. But we haven't talked a lot about the United States going places and trying to dominate it. This was all brand new, and it was only possible because we were now, at the turn of the century, a powerful country. We had not been a powerful country until the turn of the century. Now, we were becoming this strong, powerful, power that we know today. Now, how did the Chinese react to all this foreign presence in their country? Well, they weren't very happy. Think about this. If you were in China, your country was being dominated by foreign powers who were getting rich off of you. So many Chinese were not very happy about this. So they took action. In 1900, there was something called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion was an uprising of Chinese nationals against the presence of foreigners in the country. They rebelled and rioted against foreigners. They killed foreigners. And in response to this, the United States and other countries sent their militaries into China to put down the uprising and use violence to do so. So this was a very brief war. Now what this shows us is the willingness of the United States to protect its interests militarily overseas. We sent soldiers to China to ensure the continuation of the open door policy, but also to ensure the continuation of American dominance there. Okay? So this is just another example of how the United States, our military was getting stronger, our influence in the world was getting stronger, and we were becoming a superpower. And this is what we have. By the early 1900s, this was the American empire, and it was vast. Okay? Our reach extended from US Virgin Islands in the Caribbean all the way out to the Philippines. And let's not forget, everything you see on there, everything that's red was ours, and most of it, not all of it, most of it was gained in just a few short years at the turn of the century. With the exception of places like, Alaska and some of these smaller islands in the Philippines. We got most of this right there around the turn of the century. So this all happened very, very quickly, and it was the beginning of the American empire, much of which we still control today. We control most of that territory you see on there today. Not all of it, but almost all of it. All right, last couple things. What was America's new role then as a result of our imperialism? Okay, one of the new things, and of course this is because of the Roosevelt corollaries to the Monroe Doctrine, we were now emerging as the constable of the world, the policeman of the world. At the very least, we were the policemen of the Western Hemisphere. We policed the Americas. Under the Roosevelt corollaries to the Monroe Doctrine, we reserved the right to intervene in the affairs of any country in our hemisphere. Okay? The only country that really got a pass, for the most part, was Canada. Okay, and that's because, of course, Canada had very close relations with Great Britain, and we were not really interested in making them mad. But anyone else, we were involved with. So over the years, and we're going to get to this, but over the years, we've meddled in the affairs of Mexico, Cuba, Guatemala, Chile. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And we've done all kinds of crazy stuff. We've overthrown leaders, we've toppled governments, we've done all kinds of things like that. And we've done it in the name of the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary. So you definitely want to remember that for the rest of the year. It's a big deal. Now, I don't want to make it all sound bad. We also were doing good, okay? We were also making peace. Another example of our newfound presence in the world was this right here, when in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt, our president, negotiated a peace treaty between two warring nations, Russia and Japan. In 1905, Russia and Japan, which was in the middle of what was called the Russo-Japanese War, came to the United States, and Roosevelt actually negotiated them a peace treaty so they could stop fighting. It was known as the Treaty of Portsmouth. Okay? And Theodore Roosevelt actually got the Nobel Peace Prize for this. Okay? So we were not only intervening for our own behalf, but we were also intervening on the behalf of world peace. So this is just another example of how the role of the United States was changing from being one of isolationism to one of intervention. Okay, now of course one of the other changes that happened as a result was, in order to protect our newfound empire, we needed to expand our Navy. I mentioned this yesterday. Our Navy was absolutely essential to protect our new empire. We had to be able to protect all these territories. So at the turn of the century, we expanded our Navy. We created a new, modern, large Navy. It was nicknamed the Great White Fleet. And we sent the Navy on a kind of a tour of the world, kind of show off the world. Hey, look what we got. We sent these ships all over the world on a show of power to let the world know just how powerful we were. Look at what we got. Look at these ships. Don't mess with us. Okay? And in fact, the legacy of this today is today the United States still commands, by far, it's not even close, the largest, most sophisticated Navy in the world. Okay? So, you know, and this is necessary, at least it was back then, not so much now, but some people would argue it's necessary now. This was necessary in order to protect all of the new territory across the world that was now under our control. We had never needed a large Navy before because we had never controlled territory abroad. That was all different now. Okay, and then last but not least, you know, the United States had joined a very elite club. And we didn't talk a lot about this, but much of the world, particularly in Europe, were engaging in imperialism at the time. European countries were seizing territory in Asia and in Africa. Okay, so we were late to the game. They were already engaging in imperialism in the late 19th century. We were a little late to the game, but once we jumped into the game of imperialism, we were all in. So we were playing catch up. Okay, the United States joined elite company with the other powerful empires of the world. You have countries like France, and Germany, and Britain, who were also engaging in imperialism. So, like this cartoon says, Uncle Sam was now one of the boys, okay, playing the game of imperialism.